Okay, well, hey there, everybody. Welcome back to another one of our series on economic regulation, the basics of economic regulation. I believe this is lecture 10 in this series. We're going to be changing gears a little bit in this session. We're going to be now shifting into talking about health, environmental safety, and product safety regulation, right? And so this is a little different than what we've talked about already, because we're now talking about regulation that potentially deals with the loss or damage to human life. And that means there's some other things that we need to consider when compared to some of the other regulatory structures we've talked about this far. There's actually been an uptick in this style of regulation in recent years. So whereas a lot of other regulation has been reduced or even disappeared, such as like in the United States, regulation of the trucking industry obviously still exists, but now is largely associated with safety aspects of that industry, whereas before it was the sort of general service, right? And so questions of sort of environmental damage, questions of worker safety, workplace safety, these are sort of the growing areas of economic regulation. Okay, now to start off with, as economists, right, what sort of a reoccurring theme in this series of lectures is sort of our role is to rationalize situations, and by that, what I mean is we want to sort of be data driven, and there should be a identifiable logic associated with the reasoning that we're employing. As an example of that, we sort of start off here, right? If we were to go out and ask people, what are the highest, most likely accidental ways to die in the United States in 2020? I suspect that folks might get one of these three, but they're not likely to get them in this order. Particularly if you were to tell people that falls, right? So people falling down is actually the third most likely accidental cause of death in 2000. I think this data is actually 2013 data, but it's going to be very similar to that in 2021. I think they'd be surprised. I think they'd be surprised by poisoning being number one. We need to understand, where the risk actually is in society, because of course if we're mitigating through regulation risk that doesn't really exist, or wasting time and imposing costs, and if we're failing to mitigate risk where it actually does exist, well, we're not managing the situation, right? Okay, now given that we're dealing with human life and the potential loss of human life, we need to sort of set some baselines, right? First off, we need to recognize that a riskless society is at present, not possible. Okay, so given that a riskless society is not possible, that implies that there is sort of a gradient or a scale of risks, right? Which risks do we work the hardest to avoid? Similarly, the cost associated with mitigating risk across the board is not the same, right? So some risks are going to be more costly to mitigate when compared to others. So taking those two ideas in combination, we have a gradient of risk cost, right? And similarly, we have a gradient of risk benefits. We need some kind of metric to determine where we are on those, right? Okay, so far in this lecture we have three things, right? And it's worth reviewing because it's rather complicated. One, we have the idea that a riskless society is impossible with the current state of technology and with human behavior being as it is. Second, we have a recognition that the perception of risk is often not accurate in society. If we were to ask people sort of what are the most likely things that are going to hurt them in a given day, it's not very likely that people are going to get that right. And that's not because they're not smart, right? Or people generally are pretty smart, right? They're pretty good at sort of assessing their situation, right? We've sort of lived for a long time as human beings and sort of had to figure that stuff out. Okay. But the reason why we tend to not be very good at it is because the way in which we see risk in society is often an inaccurate depiction of actual risk. So, for example, airplane disasters, which are obviously tremendously unfortunate, they get a lot of attention, right? So people see them a lot, but it's actually, flying is really quite safe in terms of activities. Slipping in the bathtub while you're showering or taking a bath, doesn't get on the news, right? It's not probably good, right? It's probably a good thing. But in fact, you're far more likely to be injured or even die as a result of that than the former. Okay. So what we see in terms of risk is often inaccurate compared to what risk is actually out there. Okay. The third thing that we have so far then is that we have at least a perception of a gradient of costs associated with risk mitigation and benefits. Okay, so where do we go from there? Is we start by getting accurate data, right? And up to this point I've not talked a lot about the accuracy and quality of data, but for sound regulation, accurate and high quality data is critical, right? We need to be making decisions based upon the best information possible. Now, sometimes in some places you're not going to have very good information, and when that's the case, you should understand that whatever regulatory you put together is likely to be deficient to the extent that your data was deficient. Okay, so being familiar with accessing, and if you don't have it, if you can get that data, right? And it may be the case that the data isn't even, like, you need to go out manually and get the data, or you and a team of individuals need to go out and manually get the data. But if at all possible, it's very important to do that. Okay, so over here we have some data, right, on age-adjusted death rates. This is United States data, 1910 to 2014. And we can see that, the world, at least the United States, is much safer today than it was 100 years ago in 1920, right? Indeed, the death rate is significantly less than a half and nearly a third of what it was 100 years ago. And we can even see that by major category, virtually all of these are lower than they were at any time over the last several generations. The only exception to that is these home deaths here, right? So that's slipping, falling, things like that. Okay, all these other ones, motor vehicles, you can see motor vehicles sort of peaked in the 1930s and there's a slight upward trend here, but generally a downward trend. They're safer than they were before. Okay, public, safer than before, sort of world, right? Work, much safer. Okay, so work here in the 1930s in the United States compared to the 2010s, it's not even close. Work was always a relatively safe space compared to, say, driving in a car, but much safer today than it was then. Okay, the second thing we should recognize with regards to sort of the data and risk mitigation is that people's preferences for risk mitigation will change over time, right? We have over here sort of this idea that as societies become wealthier, their focus tends to shift increasingly towards the mitigation of risk. That is, in relatively underdeveloped economies, risk mitigation takes a relatively low priority. In more developed economies that are wealthier, risk mitigation takes on a more significant priority when compared to other aspects of the economy. Once we sort of have a good idea about where we stand with regards to risk, incidence of risk, a given risk, right, then we can start to think about the relative costs and benefits of mitigating that risk. Right? Now, a good way of going about doing this, once we have an idea of how serious the risk is, to what the costs and benefits of some idea about what we'll talk more about that in a second, but we have some idea that we need to weigh costs and benefits. One of the things, what are the steps associated with, with putting together this analysis, right? Well, first off, what are we trying to achieve? What is the point of this? Are we trying to shoot for nobody getting hurt? Are we sort of shooting for, nobody gets hurt except for by their own volition, right? They were trying to get hurt, or they were being reckless. What are we going for here? What alternatives are there? Like maybe it's the case, like maybe this activity doesn't even need to exist. Maybe maybe there's a substitute, right? That's lower risk that we could just encourage people into, discourage them out of this. Who are the affected parties? Extremely important, right? So you all those affected parties are going to be brought into the conversation about sort of what the regulation should look like, what degree of risk mitigation should be employed, and what some of the basic strategies we might go about to do that. What measurements will we use? Okay, so for example, if a person gets a scratch on their arm, it has to clean it up with some soap and water and put a bandage on it. Are we gonna count that as damage, or are we going to use like work days lost, or are we going to use like hospital costs, or are we going to use loss of life? Extreme example. And if we're going to use loss of life, what are we going to use then? Are we going to use like lost wages to determine the value there? Okay, there's a whole series of sort of questions of how we're going to measure mitigation, success, and failure in these. Okay, we're going to have to map the costs and benefits. Okay, we're going to have to determine the sensitivity, right? So what are the sort of elasticities there? Okay, we're going to have to determine what the appropriate discount rate is, right? So if we save a person's life, or if a person's life is lost, of course that's an event that doesn't just happen and stop, right? If a person's life is lost, then that life is lost forever, right? So how do we discount costs and benefits in the future to the present, right? So how do we value that sort of aggregate loss or aggregate benefit? Let's start introducing some of the tools, and mind you, this is just an introduction to discounting. Okay, present value formulas, discounting processes in general can be quite sophisticated. However, they're all based upon this basic idea, okay, where present value can be expressed in terms of future value over 1 plus discounted discount rate to the relevant time periods, power of the relevant time periods. Conversely, we can flip it around and we can express future value in terms of present value. We can flip it around again and express it all in terms of R, you name it, right? So the algebra will allow us to express any of these variables in terms of all the others. Okay. Now, present value, of course, is what's the value today. Future value is the value that we would receive or have to pay or something like that at some point in the future. R is a discount rate. Okay, so R, when economists talk about discount rate, they're saying at what rate are future values being discounted to the present. In other words, if I get $100 today, or I get $100 5 years from now, how much better is getting $100 today than 5 years ago, or 5 years from now? Now you might think about that for a second. You might say, well, maybe it's the interest rate, because if I get $100 today and I can earn 5% interest every year, maybe it's like I need to have that much more 5 years from now. So the original amount, 500 plus the interest I would have earned, and that's a reasonable way to discount. It might be the anticipated inflation rate. Okay, it might be both of those. Okay, there might be other things, right? Like you might say, like, okay, well, it's not inflation rate. It's also not the interest rate. Maybe it's like the amount I could have earned if I invested it in stocks or bonds. Okay, there's no universally correct answer as to what the discount rate is. What you do is you make a choice based upon the questions you're being asked, what the appropriate discount rate is, and then you justify that when you write it up. So you give examples about why you think that was the best, but of course it's always open to scrutiny, right? relevant time periods also can be a little difficult. Do we do sort of every day, right? Every month, every year? Is it continuous? There can be some disagreement there about what the appropriate number of time periods is, even when the duration of time is given, like say a year. Okay. Okay, just a quick note about R, right? So as mentioned, right? So what is discount rate? Well, as I said, there's no sort of universally correct answer to what R should be, right? But you can see here that the amount that it can vary for different types of policy questions can be extreme, right? It can be extreme. You can have situations where we have very, very low discounting and others where it's very high. And that has to do with a couple different things. Another slightly more sophisticated way of thinking about R is to use a capital asset pricing model, or CAPM, as they're almost always shortened to. And those, again, these can get quite sophisticated and do based upon sort of how many bells and whistles you want to put on your model. And again, you'd sort of put those on or leave them off as appropriate, but the basics are here, right? And I'm going to use the cursor this time because it's a little more complicated. I want you to follow through what I'm going on. This here is your estimated or needed return, okay, depending upon the nature of problem on the left-hand side. On the right-hand side, then, we have the return of a risk-free asset. Okay, now you might be thinking like, well, nothing's risk-free. That's right, nothing's risk-free. So here we have to choose what we think is the least, sort of the basis of risk-free. And traditionally, the return on a risk-free asset, what we generally use is U.S. Treasury debt. Okay, so now for those of you who aren't economists who happen to be watching this or in finance, right, that's U.S. government debt. As a practical matter, if we think about the debt of the largest world governments, those are pretty darn close to risk-free. So the United States or Japan, for that matter, even some of you may say, well, Japanese debt situation, right? But even so, it's pretty low risk. Canada, right? The UK, these are all. If you take my course on basic macroeconomics, all right. So some of you may be saying like, oh, I don't, disagree. If you take my course on basic macroeconomics, I explain in great depth why that is, right? And you don't need to believe me, right? You can just look at like the market, the needed market return on those assets to generate sufficient demand. Okay, and it's low risk. Okay, so that's what we generally use for risk-free, right? And then beta here, okay, is a covariance variance ratio, right? Okay, talk about that more in the in-class portion of this class. If you're just again watching this, you can kind of look that up, what that's all about. But then ERM is the expected market return, and what market are we going to look at? In the United States, we may look at like the S&P 500. If we're in Japan, we might be looking at Nikkei, so on and so forth. Like there's a lot of markets that might be relevant to our situation. And then of course RF again is a risk-free asset. So we can see that this here is a coefficient on this risk differential. Now once we've sort of figured out what our appropriate discount is, R, right, then we need to start figuring out how we're going to be measuring costs and benefits of mitigating risk, right? And there are a variety of ways to do that. The first one that I want to talk about, and one that's often used, are so-called hedonic models. Okay, and how those work is we say that the anticipated market price, or the value, right, the benefit of a given thing, is a function of a variety of attributes that it may possess. Okay, so hedonic models do this by actually looking at different situations and then looking at how the price varies across them. So for example, you may look at a bunch of home sales that are adjacent to an airport, and then look at a large sample of similar homes that are not adjacent to an airport, but otherwise have similar attributes, okay, across the set, okay, and you look at how much more those houses sell for when they're away from the airport than when they're next to the airport. Okay, and that gives you some idea of the value of mitigating the negative externalities of being by an airport, what those are worth to people, right? So if they're willing to pay $200,000 for a 3-bedroom house when it's near the airport, but you take that same house, you plop it, or you move it, 10 miles away from the airport, and now they're willing to pay $300,000 for it. Well, it tells you that being located next to an airport costs that house $100,000. We use regression analysis to estimate these. Another way, before I get to this, right, another way in which we estimate costs and benefits are using what are often called contingent valuation models, where we would so with hedonic models we're looking at actual price variations. With contingent variation models, right, we're looking at hypothetical values. So we might ask people, we might go to the people near the airport and say, hey, if we eliminated the noise of the airport, what would it be worth to you? Would it be worth $100, $1,000, $10,000? We do that over a large sample of individuals, and then we can come up essentially a demand curve for risk mitigation, marginal benefits. Okay, then moving on to the last topic for today's lecture, we need to also understand that in any of these there are political factors, right? And this is something that I've continually touched upon through this series of lectures, right? As economists, we have an idea, right, about which, sort of what should be regulated, how it should be regulated, what should not be regulated based upon economic factors. But of course, society often has different ideas about what should occur, and oftentimes we end up mitigating risks that maybe as economists we wouldn't choose to mitigate, but political forces have demanded it, and so we need to sort of always recognize that this is going to go on behind the scenes, that a lot, or maybe even most of what we do is going to be sort of rationalizing from our perspective sort of irrational choices about what should occur here. What we're going to be doing in the coming lectures is be talking a little bit about modeling political action, and so that's something that we could potentially stack on top of our regulatory models. What sort of causes people to vote the way they do? How do people form interest groups, and why do they do that? And then when they how do those interest groups come to bear upon political action? When sort of how do groups of people force political action and force regulation to occur? Okay, that's plenty enough for this time. We'll see you again next time. You can see we're going to be expanding upon that idea in the next lecture, one of the ideas we've been talking about today, and I'll see you there. Okay, take care, everybody.